For joining today's lecture here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. I'm Asmaret Askerom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center. Our speaker today is Dr. Karl-Heinz Kemp. Dr. Kemp is currently an Associate Fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Up until last year, he was a Special Envoy of the Political Director at Germany's Federal Ministry of Defense. And prior to that, he was president of the Federal Academy for Security Policy in Berlin. He's also held positions in NATO and on the planning staff of Germany's Federal Foreign Office. Dr. Kemp's talk today is on Germany's nuclear interest. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, polling in Germany showed a shift in sentiment. And for the first time, a majority of Germans, 52%, favored keeping U.S. nuclear weapons in Germany. Dr. Kemp is here to help us understand how Germany's interest and also perspectives on nuclear and deterrence have been affected by Russia's invasion. In terms of the format for the lecture, our speaker will take about 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes to present, and then we'll turn to the audience for the Q&A session. Please start raising your hands electronically during the lecture instead of waiting until the end. That way we can jump right into the Q&A session. So with that said, Dr. Kemp, welcome to CGSR. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. So first I have to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Many of you might ask, why should someone in Los Alamos or in San Francisco or even in New York be interested in Germany's nuclear interests? Well, because the entire talk is also about European nuclear interests. It's pretty much the same, not completely, but pretty much the same. And also it's a talk about extended deterrence, which means the US protection, nuclear protection for Europe, something which is currently highly debated in Europe, Germany also, but also in Europe in general, because of the Trump factor. So what would happen if Donald Trump would enter in the White House next time? So for all these reasons, I think even someone in Los Alamos might have a little interest in the topic. So what are we talking about? It certainly has become a no-brainer that the Ukraine war changed our means European/German, even maybe even the US security policies thinking. Of course, also in the nuclear realm, particularly in Germany. This surprised many allies because, and it also surprised many Germans, because Germany was often criticized as soft on defense, anti-nuclear, not even trying seriously to reach 2%. And as it has been just said before, in June last year, a couple of months after the Russian attack on Ukraine, we had a public poll in Germany indicating that 52% of the Germans are in favor of US nuclear weapons on German soil. And 65% of these supporters were voters of the Greens, the classical anti-nuclear party. So what the heck happened in a country which was and will remain non-nuclear, and which saw the sharpest anti-nuclear protests in the past, in the 80s and in the 90s. So apparently it's worth to have a closer eye on Germany and nuclear deterrence. I will try to raise three simple questions today. Named first, what has the Ukraine war changed with regard to nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence? Second question, the entire talk about what are Germany's nuclear interests? And as I said, they are pretty much congruent to the European nuclear interests. And third, always the question when you are in an administration, what needs to be done? What needs to be done in Germany? What needs to be done in NATO to cope with the challenges which we now have with regard to nuclear deterrence and the new situation of the Russian war in Ukraine? Let me start with the issue of what actually did Ukraine change so much fundamentally with regard to nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. I think there are at least 5 points that have to be mentioned. First, it is obvious that nuclear deterrent or nuclear weapons played a crucial role right from the outset of the war. Russia has threatened the use of nuclear weapons against those who support Ukraine in a way which didn't even happen in the darkest hours of the Cold War. Putin, by the way, to be fair, Putin was much more careful in his threats. He was saying that Russia might use nuclear weapons only after its vital interests are threatened, which means more or less the security of its own territory, which means an attack on Russian soil. Others in the Russian administration and around Medvedev made it much more clear. By the way, Putin mentioned this nuclear threat also in a phone call with our German Chancellor Scholz. This might explain why the German government is still very careful with regard to the danger of escalation. Whether too much careful or not too much is a different issue. So far, fortunately, this nuclear threat did not become reality. I personally think that Russia will not use nuclear weapons for a number of reasons. I think they would not gain anything if they would use a nuclear weapon. Then the question is, where would they use it? With what purpose? What do they expect to happen after this? But at the end of the day, nuclear escalation cannot be excluded. You can also argue that Putin already did a couple of stupid things. So the fact that something doesn't sound very rational might not keep him from doing so. But so far, thanks God, we didn't have such a thing. Moreover, another reason why nuclear weapons played a crucial role in the conflict right from the beginning is that nuclear weapons, Russian nuclear weapons and nuclear threats, safeguarded, so to speak, the Russian invasion and made the war possible. Yes, it is counterfactual, but if you would imagine Russia without nuclear weapons, I don't think that they would have waged a war against Ukraine. And if they would, also counterfactual, but still as a thought experiment, the West or the US or NATO or whoever might have long intervened and might have defeated Russia decisively. So basically, the US nuclear weapons safeguarded and protected Russian invasion in Ukraine. Second point, second consequence of the war, there will be no arms control or disarmament mechanisms with Russia for many years to come, because there is no base for any trust in the Russian regime, and without a minimum of trust, of course, you cannot enter into any arms control negotiations. This is a tragedy. It is a tragedy because we are already lacking elements of communication and elements of confidence building. We don't have these channels currently now. So if things are going wrong, danger of misinterpretation, misunderstandings, there is no chance to have secure lines of communication to this. So it's a problem. And this means not only it's a catastrophe with regard to the lacking mechanisms, also it means that Russia's nuclear posture will remain as it is now. And also the Chinese nuclear posture will remain. It will even grow for a number of reasons. Third consequence, the idea of the nuclear-free world has proven to be what it always was, namely an illusion, a simple illusion. And this is not tragic at all because it helps to get rid of pipe dreams. Pipe dreams President Obama had in 2009, pipe dreams the UN has with regard to the ban treaty of 2021. Not to be misunderstood, I think we all agree that a nuclear-free world might be a better one. Might be, I'm not completely sure. However, we will not have it. And we will not have it because getting rid of nuclear weapons would be so cumbersome and difficult, and confidence and trust. No, simply because most of the nuclear weapon states don't want to give up their nuclear weapons. Whether we like it or not, most or actually all nuclear weapon states regard nuclear weapons as an element of their security. We might understand this, we might not understand this, they still do, which means Pakistan wants to keep their nuclear weapons because of India. India wants to keep up their nuclear weapons because of China. Russia wants to keep the nuclear weapons for the reasons I just mentioned. Certainly Israel will keep its nuclear weapons, particularly after the experiences in the recent month. France will keep its nuclear weapons for arguments of grandeur or what have you. North Korea will keep their nuclear weapons as a means of the survival of the regime, which means the UN ban treaty, in my personal view, is not only completely irrelevant because it will not change anything, it even harms the credibility of the United Nations at a time when the authority of the UN is dwindling anyway due to the international conflict situation. So I'm not sure whether this was a smart idea. We have two nations in NATO who took an observer status in this treaty. It's Germany and Norway, but both reduced this to the lowest diplomatic level, which means no high-level observer state, and so on. So this is an illusion, and I'm not completely unhappy that it has been proven to be an illusion. Point number 4. All this means that nuclear weapons will remain a factor in world politics, and the Ukraine war has even raised their relevance because, as I said, it protected Russia, from external intervention. And this is why Iran, for instance, is so keen on getting nuclear weapons. And this is why also the number of nuclear weapon states is likely to rise in the future. Should Iran acquire nuclear weapons, of course, countries like Saudi Arabia might think twice of getting them as well. We cannot keep Iran from going nuclear, and this might lead others in the region to follow. We even have in the meantime South Korean nuclear musings. I don't know whether they are serious or not, but the idea, if the Americans do not make the extended deterrence promise more credible, South Korea might acquire their own nuclear weapons. Not sure whether it's serious or not, but you see that the topic is around. And this means that nuclear deterrence keeps an important role in war prevention as it still confronts every attack against a nuclear state with the risk of nuclear escalation. And point number 5, from a German point of view, this means for Germany and also for other NATO members that nuclear deterrence will still be provided by the United States. There is no other provider now. We'll talk about in a minute whether France could be a provider. My answer is no. So the US will remain the key provider of nuclear deterrence for the European allies. This doesn't make it easier, simply because the transatlantic relations are not as robust as they were decades ago. The US, for very good reason, is less willing to subsidize European security, and the resurgence of an isolationist president cannot be excluded, as I said earlier. So it is crucial from the European point of view to make the transatlantic relationship Trump-proof as far as this is possible. And I think that the German move with the so-called Zeitenwende, the title change, to put 100 billion euros on the table to say this is for German armed forces in the next 5 years, which means 20 billion every year, which is a hell of a lot compared to our defense budget. This means that this is a good start to take away one of the key criticisms we got from the US, for good reasons, that the Europeans and particularly Germans are still free riders with regard to defense. I hope that others in NATO will follow. For the time being, only 19 of all NATO members fulfill the 2%. And I personally found it scandalous that rich industrial powers like Canada or Italy are still around 1.4, 1.35, 1.42%. This is not acceptable. The flip side of all this, what I was just mentioning, is that we will have to deal with deterrence in future, and we have to deal with a fairly dangerous concept, something that can go wrong. We cannot exclude the use of nuclear weapons. The failure of deterrence would be a disaster. And as you all know, nuclear deterrence is full of dilemmas and open questions, and dilemmas which you cannot solve. We always try to do it through technical means, but actually you cannot. And the biggest issue, the biggest weakness, or the biggest inconsistency of nuclear deterrence is the issue of credibility. How credible is it that, or how credible is your threat of nuclear retaliation if you risk your self-destruction because the other side might fire back? And this credibility problem gets even worse when we talk about extended deterrence. The idea that nuclear countries like the US take a nuclear commitment for their non-nuclear allies. And this is a very old question we have in NATO. How credible is the US nuclear commitment for the non-nuclear allies? How likely is it that a US president risks San Francisco or New York to save Berlin or Warsaw? Always a question we had in NATO since decades. And Europeans, or NATO itself, always looked for technical solutions. So this is why this entire dual track discussion we had in the early 80s in Europe was, can we minimize, can we diminish the credibility problems? And the logic was, if we have long-range nuclear missiles, Western NATO nuclear missiles in Europe, which can reach Russian territory, then this entire extended deterrence thing is more credible. Whether you believe this or not, there is a lot of nuclear theology in this entire business. You can believe it or not. Do really the B-61 bombs, which we have still stationed in Germany now, do they make any US commitment more credible? Who knows? And actually, I don't want to find out. And this is not only important, and at the end of the day, it's not important what I believe or what you believe. At the end, it's important what Russia believes, what the potential aggressor believe can. And this is actually a strength of this ambiguity we have. Yes, we don't know whether, we Europeans don't know whether the US will step in case of an attack. On the other hand, Russia or Putin cannot exclude it. And he cannot even exclude it from an isolationist president, because Donald Trump might, in all his wisdom, argue, I bombed the hell out of them. So this entire idea of ambiguity has two sides. So this is why we are dealing with a concept which is dangerous, contradictual, and that's why it's so difficult to sell in Germany to the public, because if deterrence goes wrong, first and foremost, the Europeans are all dead. And this is not something which is a nice situation. France, by the way, does not believe in the idea of extended deterrence. And that's why France acquired its own nuclear force. For Paris, nuclear weapons are national weapons. They can only protect the territory of the owner. That's why the French say, la nucléaire ne se partage pas. You cannot divide the nuclear. And this is a fairly logical conclusion. This is not stupid at all, because, as I said, by this day, they circumvent all these credibility questions which we have in NATO. But this means that by definition, France cannot be a provider of extended deterrence for their other NATO or Western allies, because they don't believe in extended deterrence. And this is why it's always surprising that since ages, there has been a discussion in the EU, particularly in Germany, on whether or not there could be a European kind of nuclear force based on, in the old days, French and British nuclear weapons. Since the UK left the EU, it would be only French nuclear weapons. This entire thing doesn't make any sense because the logic doesn't work. France doesn't accept this logic. And so far, no French president, also not Macron, has moved away from this traditional Gaullist dogma that extended deterrence doesn't work, it's a national weapon. Having said all this, point number 2 now, what are then the German nuclear interests? A country which is non-nuclear, which will never try to acquire nuclear weapons. We don't have a discussion on this. So the question is, what are the German nuclear interests? In the Cold War, or during the Cold War, West Germany was located directly at the Iron Curtain, and it was the potential nuclear, or the fairly secure nuclear battlefield if the Cold War had become a hot one. And this means at that time, West Germany, NATO partner, had 3 very simple and logical nuclear interests. First, the interest was deterrence has to work. Because if deterrence doesn't work and the Cold War becomes a hot one, we Germans don't have to be concerned about the outcome. Because we would be completely nuked and completely devastated. So the first interest was deterrence has to work, conventional and nuclear deterrence, because even a conventional war would have completely destroyed Germany due to our geostrategic location. And this is why Germany accepted thousands and thousands of US nuclear weapons, at a time even some UK nuclear weapons, on our soil. 7,000 to 8,000, depending on the counting and when, which is the hell of a lot. And it takes a while for a country to accept this, because you can understand that if this goes wrong, we are all dead. First nuclear interest. The second nuclear interest was to have an information on what our nuclear allies, first and foremost the US, but also the UK, are doing there, and what's happening with these nuclear weapons on our soil. So information on numbers, on types, on plans, on strategies, because we would be affected of this. And the third nuclear interest was not only to have information on plans and stationing and concepts, but also to have an impact on mostly US nuclear planning. And the US, surprisingly actually, gave all these things. It gave information to the Europeans, and it gave also the possibility to have an impact, to have a say, not in the decision to launch nuclear weapon, but in the plans and in the policies. Because, for instance, we Germans had the national interest, so to speak, not to have NATO nuclear weapons detonate on the GDR, East Germany, because we still thought and still think, and this is the case, that this is all Germany. This was one of the nuclear interests. So our interest was to affect US nuclear planning, for instance, not to do this. And the US gave and granted all this influence and knowledge via the nuclear planning group in NATO. And that was pretty much a success, and that made nuclear deterrence bearable for us Germans and for all other Europeans who were affected by the problem. We even had NATO consultation guidelines which foresaw some consultations with the affected countries prior to a nuclear use. It had also the nice sentence, time and circumstances permitting. So whether or not the US would have consulted, no one knows. And as I said, I didn't want to find out. If we are now back in the nuclear deterrence world, in the Article 5 world, after the Russian attack on Ukraine, then deterrence counts again. And then, of course, Germany again has nuclear interests, and Europe has nuclear interests, and they are pretty much the same, which means first the credibility of deterrence, because we are still fairly close to the opponent, closer than the US. Second, information, to understand what the concepts of the US are. And third, participation in developing concepts and so on and so forth. Not participation in the decision to launch a nuclear weapon. This is a prerogative of the US president, and he will never share this with anyone else for good reasons. And this is why today we again, Germany, after many years of not having taken care of the entire nuclear deterrence issue for a while, we now have to once again try to influence nuclear strategy, the nuclear strategy debate, because we Germans, as we are geostrategically, we do not want to be the object of other nations' deterrence plans, but we want to shape, if you want to say, our nuclear future. This will not be easy because our political elites have forgotten most of the nuclear issues for good reasons, because it was not necessary or it was not believed to be necessary after the Berlin Wall came down. The NATO's nuclear planning group was basically dormant until 2014. After 2014, NATO changed its nuclear activity significantly. Because until 2014, the idea was nuclear planning is no longer necessary, so you don't need a nuclear planning group. So a part of the German Zeitenwende, the German tidal change, the complete 180 degrees U-turn of our defense policy will be to pursue our nuclear interests again. And that leads to the third question, simple, logical, what to do. Let me first discuss for a second what Germany should not do. And I mentioned this already, we should not talk about German nuclear weapons. Fortunately, hardly anyone in Germany does. There are one or two academics who do this in talk shows, but no serious political power, no serious political party talks about the potentiality, the idea of a German nuclear capacity for very good reasons. We have legally binding commitments not to do this, and we will, at least in my lifetime, I hope, and I want to live a little bit, we will not change this. So this is not the issue. The other thing we should not talk about, I said earlier, is any kind of a European nuclear deterrence. We now start, actually, strange enough, in Germany we have a debate coming up that the EU, no one really knows how why, should have its own nuclear capacity. Those who discuss this don't ask who is going to decide, who is going to provide these nuclear weapons. Are they national, France or whoever, or are they obtained by a European EU body, and who's deciding? This entire thing is only half cooked, so it doesn't make much sense. I would skip this entire debate because it sets us on the wrong track. So what we should do instead is, first and foremost, that Germany and many other European countries, we have to acquire nuclear expertise again. What in NATO is called raising the nuclear IQ, raising the nuclear intelligence quotient, which means German government officials, parliamentarians, civil servants, and also journalists have to be educated again on the nuts and bolts of nuclear deterrence. As simple as it sounds, we don't have it. We have only, there's a handful of people who in the recent years discussed these issues, and we have to understand all this, and we also have to understand the dilemmas included, because it doesn't make sense to omit them. The number of university professors in Germany who teach nuclear issues is a very small one-digit number. I recall 2 or 3 maximum. And this, of course, doesn't make any sense. I was the president of our National Federal Security Academy, where government people in the government get educated on security policy issues. And I recall that in 2016, I took over the office in 2015. In 2016, I proposed, and this academy is under the Chancellor's office, under the Defense Ministry, and under the Foreign Ministry. These are my three bosses, the Chancellor, Foreign Minister, and the Defense Minister. And I proposed to include nuclear deterrence issues in our courses. And at that time, 2016, 2 years after Crimea, the answer of the ministries was, no, it's not the right time to do this. So, and also, by the way, the General Staff College of the German Armed Forces, the Bundeswehr, does not teach nuclear deterrence in a serious way. So this is something which is not acceptable. And by the way, in the Cold War times, in the Ministry of Defense, we had entire branches dealing with nuclear deterrence, which means some 8 to 10 people. Today, we have in the NATO section of the German MOD, we have one officer who does this part-time, which means he has a number of other issues on his table, and he also deals with nuclear deterrence. So that's the first necessity, raising the nuclear IQ. Second point is, and they are all closely intertwined, second point is that Germany and NATO in general have to actively pursue the nuclear debate in NATO for a nuclear consensus. Yes, after Crimea 2014, NATO did a lot to improve nuclear deterrence. We evolved a higher readiness of our nuclear capacities. We have more exercises, but all this was, so to speak, on the hardware side, on the military side. But we did not anything sufficient on the strategy side, on the software side, on the political side. The last nuclear strategy, public open nuclear strategy document in NATO we have is the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review of 2012. 12 years old in the meantime. By the way, the document is as complicated as the title sounds, so it's nothing you want to read. And this document, 2012 was before Crimea. At that time, Russia was still a partner. We were dreaming about the Arab Spring and so on and so forth. So it becomes very clear. By the way, China was at that time regarded as a benevolent country striving for its economic success. And this means that a new strategy is long, a new coherent concept, document, a new DDPR, call it as you like, is long overdue. And I think that important countries in NATO, and Germany is one, should push for such a strategic discussion. Germany should, because it is a heavyweight in NATO, and because we are a nuclear stationing country, which gives us a special stake in the entire debate. And also because by doing so, NATO Germany could gain lost trust in NATO. Particularly in Eastern Europe, Germany had lost trust due to its Russia policy, Nord Stream 2, what have you. These are not things which created much support in Poland or in the Czech Republic or in other Eastern European countries. However, if we do this, if Germany imposes or is in favor of a nuclear debate in NATO, we Germans and we Europeans have to be prepared for some difficult questions. For instance, the question, what about the nuclear arsenal? Is the current nuclear arsenal sufficient? B-61 bombs stationed in a number of European countries to be brought by airplane to the target area. Does this make sense? Do we need more or different nuclear weapons? Do we need a new double track decision? Something like this. The answer does not necessarily have to be yes, but at least the debate will come up and we will have to answer this. And this reminds a little bit this might remind many people on the anti-nuclear protests in Germany of the 80s. So do we want this? Can we avoid this? A question which is on the table. Another question difficult question, which will come up in such a debate if we do this DDPR, call it as you like, are the current nuclear locations in Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, or in Italy, does it make sense to have the US weapons there? Or would they logically or strategically much more sense to be stationed in Poland? Let's say in Poland, Poland is strongly rallying for having US nuclear weapons on its soil. And this is not only a question of money, but also a question, are now the Germans ready to get rid of the nuclear weapons they never wanted to have? Because actually now US nuclear weapons grant a certain influence of NATO in NATO, of Germany in NATO. So you see there are a number of questions involved. By the way, what would happen to the NATO nuclear posture should Ukraine become a member? If Ukraine becomes a member, we add roughly 1,300 kilometers between the Polish eastern border and the Ukrainian eastern border to be defended by NATO. So what does this mean for nuclear deterrence? So there are a number of questions coming up. The third thing we Germans and also we Europeans should do, in addition to the IQ that has to be risen, and in addition to having this new nuclear consensus, the third thing would be Germany should take up the French offer for a nuclear dialogue. France very often offered a nuclear dialogue to Germany, as I believe very often with the idea in the back of the mind as a competition to the US nuclear deterrence. So to drag, so to speak, Germany on the other side, to the dark side or to the light side, whatever you want to do it. A nuclear debate with France, not about France as an alternative for nuclear deterrence, but France as a great important country, nuclear country, and we have the same nuclear interest with regard to France, to understand what are your concepts, can we have an impact on your plans, because also we are fairly closely located to your French target area. So Germany never took up the French offer for these talks. We should have bilateral talks with France. We should have trilateral talks with France and the UK, because that the UK has left the EU doesn't mean that it's no longer European power. It certainly is. So a European nuclear dialogue, France, UK, Germany, and other countries interested, would make a lot of sense. France and the UK have this dialogue under the Lancaster House agreements, but such a model would be important and interesting for us as well. To do this, and that brings us back to the beginning, we would have to raise our nuclear IQ, to have people in our government, in our journalism, in our administrations able and capable to do such a dialogue. Let me conclude, I have a few minutes left. Let me conclude with a little off-track point. The German Zeitenwende, this German title change, which happened actually 3 days after the attack of Russia on Ukraine, which means this fundamental turn of German defense policy, which also has a nuclear dimension. You might recall that, as I said, Germany announced this title change on the 27th of February, 3 days after the attack, with a speech of our Chancellor, in which he promised the 100 billion euros for the Bundeswehr. Whether this is enough or not is a completely different discussion, but it's already something. And I think that the UK or the French military forces would be very happy if they would get offered 100 billion for the next 5 years. But this Zeitenwende is much more. It also implied or included the procurement of the F-35 fighter aircraft for nuclear missions, which means Germany codified the allegedly so nuclear critical German Sea, codifies the nuclear role and the German participation in this nuclear business for the next decades. It also implied a fundamental change in the heads of our people, in the brain of our people. For instance, at the beginning of the war, Germany, in an embarrassing way, offered 5,000 helmets for Ukraine. That was an embarrassing movement of our previous government, of the current government, but in the old mindset. In the meantime, Germany is the second largest supporter of Ukraine in military and also economic terms, which is the hell of a lot. Because this required to change our weapons export policy. We had the policy of not delivering weapons into areas of tension. There's even a war going on, so you see a lot of things have changed. And in the meantime, we are offering weapons export to Israel, tank ammunition. We offered, we will deliver fighter aircraft, the Eurofighter to Saudi Arabia. There are often, so all things which had been impossible allegedly years and years ago now are possible. And the fundamental question, and that's why I take on this issue for a second, we always get from foreigners, when we had delegations from the US, from the UK, from other NATO countries coming to Germany, to the German Ministry of Defense, they were always asking, nice, your Zeitenwende, perfect, but is it lasting? Or is it a flash in the pan? Is this really a fundamental change which will remain, or will you fall back if the war is over or whatever happens, then you will fall back in your old German habits? And my answer always was, this Zeitenwende, this tidal change is lasting. And it is lasting for three reasons. The first reason is very simple, because it was done by a coalition of Social Democrats and Greens, both parties who do not have the military or the nuclear in their DNA, in their genes, which means it took them a very painful process of adaptation to the new realities. And actually, the Greens adapted much quicker than the Social Democrats, an old arms control party, did so far. And yes, there is always the danger whether it flips back. And in that sense, tragically, one must say, the daily pictures we see from Ukraine, the bombings and the butchers and all these terrible things, help to keep up this idea of something has to change fundamentally. The second reason why I think this Zeitenwende is lasting is because we have a broad consensus in the parliament. There is no other policy issue on which we have such a broad consensus from the left to the right than supporting Ukraine. We have discussions on how much, how quick, is this enough? Shall we deliver the Taurus? Are tanks necessary? Yes or no? But the fundamental question of supporting Ukraine as long as it takes, or as long as we can, is not disputed. And even at the political fringes, at the extreme left and the extreme right, people are asking themselves whether it is such a good idea always to support the Putin line. And the third reason why I believe that this Zeitenwende is lasting is because we have a fundamentally different public opinion than we had in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. In 2014, there was the German mood, and it was a little bit the same in many other European countries, not in the UK, not in the US maybe, but in other European countries, say, yeah, you know, Crimea, it was always a little Russian, and, you know, no one was really willing to take any burden for this issue. Now the situation is completely different. For the first time, we had, and as I said earlier, an explicit nuclear threat also expressed against Germany. And this changed a lot in our public opinion, because the Ukraine war is not Afghanistan. It is geographically very close. The distance from the north of Germany, from, let's say, Kiel, one of the cities in the north, to Garmisch, the most southern city, is the same distance than from Berlin to Ukraine. So there is also this feeling of closeness, which makes this entire thing so dangerous in the public mind. And so this means we have still a broad support in the public for keeping up the sanctions, which harm our economy, which harm our people. The butter costs more and the milk and all the things, so we have an inflation. Still, there is support for sanctions. And yes, we have also voices in Germany who are still on the Russia line and want to go back to cheap gas of Russia. Yes, but it's not the majority. So this means that there is a change. So I personally believe that this Zeitenwende is lasting. I personally believe that Germany got this idea that also nuclear questions have to be debated in future more thoroughly. We cannot escape these discussions anymore. And with that happy note, let me stop here and thank you for your patience.